His book, Congress from the Inside, is a collection of his observations over 7 years of congressional service. We spoke with Representative Brown in his office for about an hour.
Congressman Sherrod Brown, at what point did you realize that you wanted to serve in the U.S. Congress?
I was in the state legislature and Secretary of State of Ohio for many years and thought of my public service as pretty much Columbus, Mansfield, Lorraine, sort of Ohio-centered. But when I left state government, actually involuntarily in 1990, I kind of looked around and I did some teaching, I did some work with Ohio State, and congressional service looked more and more attractive. It was a place to really do the kinds of things I care about in terms of health care, in terms of working internationally in health care and foreign policy and all of that, and it seemed to fit in a lot of ways, and 1992 was an opportunity.
What does serving mean to you?
Serving means, first of all, knowing what people want. I spent a good deal of my time, as you can see in the book, figuring out ways to reach out and talk to people and get their input. And serving is taking that and running it through my sense of values and sense and commitment to social justice and doing the best I can for the people in my district and the people of this country.
You're in your 4th term now. How has it changed since you arrived?
My first term was difficult, dealing with a very angry electorate, a real sort of frenetic time in Congress, very defensive for a lot of us, and that were Democrats especially. Now it's sort of swung back to a public that's interested but doesn't have the sort of antipathy towards the institution and towards politicians to the degree that it had in 1993.
Recently, you wrote and published this book, Congress from the Inside. How much of this book is Congress from the inside, and how much of it is inside Sherrod Brown?
I don't know how you pull those apart in a lot of ways. It's a book that it's not a kiss and tell. I don't say negative things about my colleagues, with the exception of some. I guess there's always sort of a Newt Gingrich exception to that, but it's more of a commentary on how Congress worked in '93 and '4, contrasted with what happened in '95 and '6. It's a first book written by a member of Congress in some time about what it was like to be a freshman, what it's like to see Congress from the inside. And when you consider there are only some 11,000 people in this nation's history in a country approaching 300 million in the next decade or so, there aren't very many people that have had this experience, and I wanted to share it so people could see what it's like to be in Congress, what it should mean to them, what Congress does, and that's very interlinked with my values and my views. So I hope that I can talk to the public about myself secondarily, but primarily the interaction I have with my constituents and what the inside of Congress really looks like.
When did you decide that you were going to write it, and how did it begin?
A professor at Denison University, who was my brother's advisor 25 years ago, I was with my daughters one day, and he said, you know, nobody's written a book about Congress as a freshman. This was about February of 1993. He said, you ought to think about that. And so I went home every weekend and just in my computer typed some notes about what had happened the week before, and at the end of the first term, I pretty much put it into book form. And then when the Democrats lost Congress, I thought, you know, I really should. This is an historic opportunity to talk about the last 2 years of Democratic control and the first 2 of Republican control, and what it means to go from a not very influential member of the majority to an even less influential member of the minority, which is pretty clearly what happened to everybody in my class, at least.
In fact, the book is almost cleaved into 2, part 1 and part 2, and the dividing line is the '94 election.
Very purposely. The first part is how you negotiate your way as a freshman into sort of why I ran and what motivated me, what this institution was like to join, the feelings of insecurity you have, the Harry Truman story, the first day he walked into the U.S. Senate and looked around and thought, my gosh, how did I get in this, to come to this beautiful chamber? How did I get here? And after about 6 months, he looked around and saw the other senators and thought, my gosh, how did they all get here? And it's a little bit of that your first term, and the feelings of anxiety and insecurity, and can I measure up to this place? But then more importantly, the book went on to talk about how you get on committees, why committee selection is the most important. You actually run for committee assignment. How getting on the right committee it really suggests the direction of your career for much of your career in Congress. Then talked about the 4 most important issues that we face: the crime bill, health care debate, the Clinton health care plan, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the budget. And how, first of all, those 4 issues in most ways cost us the House as Democrats in 1994, and how those four issues continue to play throughout this decade. That's the first part of the book. The second is more in talking very much in military terms, the terms that Newt Gingrich used. The campaign, the reaction, the storming the palace, all the things that the speaker talked about himself as the revolution, the counter-revolution, and he put it in terms that he used, talking about those for next 2 years in very historic times.
When you begin the book with this moment of your first day in Washington in January as a member of Congress, you begin in the preface here, you write that this story of a newly elected representative navigating his way through Congress begins in hopeful times when most of us were optimistic that partisan gridlock was over as a huge, diverse, goal-oriented freshman class was sworn in.
Yeah, we thought things were going to be a little more positive during those 2 years than they were. The Democrats, for the first time in a couple of decades, controlled everything, early 15 years, controlled everything, the House, the Senate, and the presidency. So the public had great expectations in a very difficult time. Huge budget deficits, trade agreements that were increasingly less popular with the public, always the controversy of guns, and a health care issue which most of official well-funded Washington was on one side and the public was on the other. Insurance and drug companies and doctors on one, patients whom we are here to serve more than insurance companies, drug companies, and doctors on the other side. And the Democrats didn't deliver. We didn't deliver on most. We delivered on the crime bill, and I think it made a difference. We delivered on the budget, and it made a difference. But those were highly unpopular issues. Congress passed NAFTA, which made a bad difference, I think. And on health care, nothing happened. And so we really, the hopes and dreams that we had ended up purely, I mean, sort of ended up as towards of the 65 Democrats in my class, 20 of them were gone in the next election, and that's pretty unprecedented for that many people to lose. But the excitement of that first day, and I started the actual, the intro, I believe, is the first line is, "My first day in Congress happened to be the most colorful day in its history. Whites and blacks, Latins and Asians, women dressed in reds and greens, the happy voices of children." My first day was the most diverse, represented the most diverse among the Democrats freshman class in the history of the institution. 65 Democrats, 20-some women, 18, 19 African Americans, 15 Latinos. The Republican side was nothing like that. There were 45 Republicans, 3 women, no blacks, I believe, and one Mexican American. So, but the country actually, the Congress, the freshman Democrats actually looked like the country. It's the first time that we really represented in the country's diversity the way it was. But in the end, you know, that didn't get us where we needed to do in terms of delivering for the public that term.
You arrived in January of '93 with members like Tom Foley, who was the Speaker of the House then, Dan Rostenkowski, head of Ways and Means, John Dingell was still head of Energy or Commerce Committee at that point. What did you, as a freshman, learn, and how did you learn from these individuals?
Well, Rostenkowski only talked to me once that I can remember, so I didn't learn much from him.
What happened?
He was chairman of Ways and Means, and I was some freshman hick from Ohio. I mean, I didn't matter to him. Foley was, most of my relationship with leadership was with Gephardt and Bondier, who were the second and third rank. Foley would sit down with the freshmen and tell terrific stories. He would tell us that one of the things he'd always talk about is when you, if you in the morning come to work, or I go out jogging, my apartment's near the Capitol, run by the Capitol, he said, if it's not a thrill for you to look up at that dome every day, you should leave. And he had been here at that point 30 years, almost 30 years, and over 30 years, and said that. Foley also said lots of people can get elected to Congress once. Nobody takes you seriously until you're reelected. And I found that. I mean, I found some people that didn't pay much attention to me my first term were real interested in talking to me after I was reelected once, and had survived that test of fire that so many of my freshman colleagues did not, for whatever reason, survive. Dingell, and so my relations with Foley were more sort of that way. Dingell, who was now the longest serving member of the House, he and his father have been here. His father from Roosevelt's first 100 days in 1933 until 1955 when he died in office, and John's been in this office since for those 44 years since. Dingell was the chairman of my committee. I got to work very closely with him, learned a terrific amount about this place, learned the importance of institutional memory, which most members of Congress don't think much about. I read, my first month, I read the Almanac of American Politics, which describes every district and every member of Congress, because I wanted to know what makes people tick and how this body got from where it was to where it is today. And I think I learned a lot from John Dingell in that way, and just how to work together and how to make things happen bipartisanly in this institution.
Would you describe that relationship possibly as mentoring with Congressman Dingell, or if not, did you have a mentor here?
My mentor more is probably David Vonier, who is also in leadership and also from Michigan, as Dingell is. My relationship with Dingell was partly somewhat mentoring. Vonier's a little closer to my age, a little more reachable in that sense, but Dingell was particularly important to show how legislation's crafted. Dingell had an uncanny ability to get unanimous or near unanimous votes out of his committee that term, even in 93, 94, when it was a particularly partisan-charged Congress. But in 95, when he became the ranking member and Tom Bliley became the chairman, those coalitions never happened. I mean, we couldn't put the same piece of legislation out unanimously, or even a majority, when the Dingell could put out 2 years earlier unanimously. I mean, it was, the skills he has are pretty unequaled in this institution, and I think the weakness of the Republicans is partly that their committee chairs and their leadership have not governed, so really didn't know how to, and don't have some of the skills of legislating that people like Dingell had.
What's it like as a freshman in this institution?
As a freshman, particularly in 93, 94, I guess the only time I was, as a freshman, nobody pays much attention to you. I mean, you're sort of so overwhelmed by the learning curve. I mean, your first year here, you got to figure out what you're going to do when you start. I mean, you got to learn the institution, the rules. You got to learn about issues. You have to hire staff, and you got to get on the right committees, committee or committees. The most important of those four is nobody generally tells us that, what the most important of the four. Clearly, the most important of the four is getting on the right committee. If you make some hiring mistakes or don't fill your office up fast enough, you can fix those. If you don't know issues well enough, you just are patient and you learn the issues that are most important to you and your committee work and your constituents. If you don't understand the House rules, if you don't understand the House rules, you just stay quiet on the House floor and don't do anything stupid, and you eventually catch on. But if you don't get on the committees you want, you may not ever get on the committee you want, or it takes you a while and you start down the seniority ladder in that committee. So that's where you should put your time, and that's what someone told me. I mean, I was lucky in that I knew to do that. Who? And Congressman Eckert, who had been in this office, not my seat, but had left here in '92 and was a friend of mine from the legislature, actually, in Ohio. But so it's pretty important that you start off that way. But beyond that, as a freshman, in those days when it looked like a permanent Democratic majority, you were pretty immaterial to the process. Today, freshmen are more celebrated because, especially in '95, when the Republicans brought in, all these freshmen gave them control of Congress, so the older members were solicitous, very solicitous toward them. And I think that's changed in the '90s. I think freshmen now are much more part of this institution in both parties than they were in the good old days or the bad old days or just the old days.
Very early on in your book, in fact, the third chapter, which is entitled In Committee, you discuss the importance of committees and how members get assigned to them. You write here on page 35 that in many ways, committee assignments define members in terms of their expertise, interests, influence, and reputations. Most members concentrate on a small number of issues, usually unique to their committee, and come to learn those areas thoroughly. Few other members of Congress, you go on to write, will reach the depth of their understanding on those issues. Expand on that.
Well, first of all, someone described this job years ago as someone comes in with a plate of really good food every morning, and you can eat a lot of things, or you can just sort of pick and choose in the things that are really important to you. If you eat a lot of the things, if you eat a lot of everything, you won't really be very effective here, because there are too many things to learn about here, and too many things to do for the human mind to grasp in a lot of sense. You can't be an expert on banking, trade, environment, healthcare, agriculture. You just can't do it all. So you get on the committees that reflect your interests. And then you become recognized, most importantly, recognized in this institution as an expert in those issues. My first term, I got on the Commerce Committee. There hadn't been a freshman in Commerce in a dozen years, although there were several put on my year. I got on the Health Subcommittee right away, and my expertise has become health and the environment. I'm now the ranking Democrat in the Health Committee, which meant if the Democrats took control of the institution in 2000, some of your viewers would like that, some of them that would scare to death, but nonetheless, if the Democrats take control in 2000, I would be chairman of the Health Subcommittee, likely. But I am looked to in this institution now as one of the half dozen or so members, I hope I am, that has that expertise in healthcare. I'm in the meetings with the President and with Gephardt and with the White House and other leaders in the Senate and House on healthcare issues. So once you get that expertise, you grow even more into it. If you flounder that first term and sort of don't figure your expertise, you're a little behind the curve, although you can catch up. But if you get on that early, it really makes a big, big difference in your career.
Why was it so important for you to get on the Commerce or the Energy and Commerce Committee?
Well, the Energy it's the old Sam Rayburn was the chair of that committee, and Rayburn and Dingell were the ones that built it into the very broad jurisdiction that it now has. It was the first committee in Congress, 1795, when Congress really didn't operate the same committee structure as now, in different forms. It was made an important committee by Rayburn and a much more important committee by Dingell. Between 50 and 60% of all the bills that come through Congress come through that committee. So from telecommunications to hazardous waste to health care to safe drinking water to managed care to all kinds of things. So I wanted to get on that committee. One, I thought I had a chance to because Ohio didn't have a seat. We had lost the seat we had. Eckert retired. And second, but more importantly, it was a committee whose jurisdiction was surrounded all kinds of things that I like, that are important to me in my district, especially health care and environment. My district, I live right on Lake Erie. Safe drinking water, clean water laws, environmental laws are very important to Northeast Ohio, as they are everywhere, but especially there. Health care, Cleveland is a major health care center, and we were going to do the Clinton health care bill that year. That was a big part of his campaign, my campaign, the campaigns of a lot of us, and I wanted to be in the middle of that and was lucky enough to get on that committee.
You represent the 13th district. You were just discussing it briefly. Expand on that. Describe your district.
It's difficult to represent in that it's very, very diverse. It's the wealthiest congressional district in Ohio. It's a district in the West End, which is heavily Catholic, blue-collar, Democrat, industrial. On the East End and the south part around Cleveland, between Cleveland and Akron and around Cleveland, is much more Republican conservative. Geauga County is the wealthiest county in Ohio. Medina is marginally Republican. But Lorain, where I live, is home of Toni Morrison, Nobel Prize winner. The eastern end of my district, James Garfield, was at Hiram College, was the first president of Hiram College. Oberlin College is in my district. But in Lorain County is really representative of sort of industrial history in this country, the history of economic, the industrial America. It's a steel mill, the U.S. Steel plant that had 13,000 workers 20 years ago now has 3,000. The people that worked in that plant were drawn from all over mostly Europe and Puerto Rico, a large number of Puerto Ricans that came up after the war. But a fellow talked to me that was Greek, came from Greece in 1951 that worked in U.S. Steel, and he told me that he said a Slovak and a Pole worked right next to me, and I couldn't talk. None of us could talk. None of us talked English, and we couldn't talk each other's language, but we figured out how to work together. And now, even on the door in front of the steel mill, it had directions about instructions on how to apply for a job. It was written in 7 different languages. So it's really the heart of industrial America and built this country, and all those cities around the Great Lakes, those old industrial ethnic cities, were really what made this country what it is. And part of my commitment in this job is to help try to rebuild that industrial base in this country.
Early on, when you were making the decision to run in the district, you talk about your bicycle tour of the district and the importance for potential members or members to learn about their district, what it's like, who lives there. What do citizens need to learn about their congressman?
I think citizens need to learn that even those of us that work hard at listening to people, I mean, doing a bike trip once in a while, or doing a town meeting, or calling people on the phone like I do from time to time that wrote us a letter, or a variety of different ways trying to meet constituents and find out what they think. I mean, constituents need to understand that they need to play in this arena too. That politics is beyond. It's a bit of a cliche, but politics is beyond being a spectator sport. That most of us will listen. Most of us are thrilled when people really do want to engage with us. I have town meetings in Sagamore Hills every year, a place called Greenwood, and it's a group of mostly older people, but not entirely. 50 to 100 people show up, and it's the best question and answer session that I can imagine. It's always good, substantive, sometimes a bit hostile, but never nasty or angry, but combative. Hostile's not the right, combative, but challenging me and I challenge them, and we all, I think, walk out thinking, you know, we know more about each other and representative government works. And I'm convinced I think if there's one theme in this book, it's that representative government does work, that things happen in this body because the public demands it. And I've seen that example after example after example. Even when people in the body are reluctant, in Congress are reluctant to do something, they'll do it oftentimes because the public says this is important to us.
Following up from that, this is a section from your chapter in the district. You write about meeting up and listening to a freshman Republican, this is back in '93, from a southern state, and as you say, who let me in on his stream of consciousness. As he relates, have you found that most of your constituents are ignorant? Don't they grate on your nerves when they don't know anything? They talk for 45 minutes and have only 5 minutes worth to say. How am I going to stand it for 2 years, let alone 10? Why don't they just leave me alone so I can do what's right?
Well, yeah, first of all, I'd make sure anybody just tuned in, those aren't my words, those are words from somebody else. That's unusual. I mean, I put that in there because this guy's still in Congress. I'm not going to mention his name, but I hope he's grown out of that. I've not talked to him about it. I know he's not probably seen the book, and he's probably he doesn't know I quoted him, but I said didn't do it by name. But because that's not the intent of the book, to embarrass people. But there are a few people that have that sort of disdain or contempt for their constituents, but I think it's a very, very small minority. Most of us come to Washington, do our jobs, and go home. There was a poll taken that's mentioned somewhere in the book about not a poll, but a focus group, and they asked just a cross-section of voters, what do you think it'd be like to have dinner at the home of your member of Congress? And people said, well, they'd show up they'd pick me up in a limousine, and they'd have a chef, and after I left, they'd be glad I'd say, aren't we glad they left? And it'd be a very expensive house, and obviously they've not been to the homes of most of us, because most of us live pretty middle-class lives. But I think that's the view people have. They have view that we're from somewhere far away, we don't come home, we don't pay attention to them, we live this life that's totally out of touch, and we look upon our constituents with disdain and contempt, and I think that's very, very unusual.
Now, you don't mention that member by name, but throughout your book, occasionally you do mention other specific members by name, and are perhaps a little unsparing in your critique of them. You write of Fred Wertheimer, not a member, but Fred Wertheimer, the former head of Common Cause, that he's the only man who could keep his job for 15 years without having accomplished anything.
No, I said without accomplished what he was hired to do. There's a difference. He might have accomplished, but he was hired to get campaign finance reform through Congress. He didn't do that.
You write of Henry Kissinger that he suffers from terminal self-importance.
Afflicted with terminal importance, I think was the term, yeah. Well, he was. I mean, is there any doubt about that? How can you look at Henry Kissinger and not think that he thinks that of himself?
One gets the sense occasionally reading the book that you perhaps enjoy maybe tweaking the establishment. Is that a correct perception?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I am in many ways very much a populist about what I think the role of government should be. I mean, the role of government in this country has been to put government on the side of the public. And, you know, the antipathy towards government in this country is interesting because I've always kind of subscribed a little bit to the term or the question, why is it that conservatives only hate big government in democratic societies? I mean, when you think about that when we are the government, we, the public, the voters, elect our government, we're at a unique place in history. Throughout most of history, people that ran the government was populated by the rich, was in the most advantaged people, was run by the most advantaged people for the most advantaged people. Democracy, on the other hand, has placed government so often on the side of doing the right things. And this country's government so often has sided with workers, have sided with the poor, have sided with cleaning up the environment, often contrary to the wishes of the elite and the richest people in the country. And there's one section here I touch on briefly that Let me just read if I could. Since the 18th century, when the Articles of Confederation were replaced, turning the loose organization of states into a more centralized constitutional system, the American people have known that a strong federal government would do a better job on some issues. Building national roads and canals, the Northwest Ordinance. My family has a 280-acre farm that came from those days. Land-grant colleges, Social Security, school lunch, Medicare, EPA, all these things were done by addressing national concerns like fighting poverty, increasing opportunity, providing health care for the elderly, enforcing civil rights, building an interstate highway system. Those were done by federal government because states couldn't clean up Lake Erie, states couldn't provide Medicare. It took the national government. That's why I then write, that's why Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg changed from, quote, the United States of America are, which is what everybody used to say prior to Lincoln, to Lincoln saying at Gettysburg, the United States of America is. It's a federalist system where a federal government does take care of clean air, take care of Medicare, take care of Social Security, take care of a highway system. It's not a loose confederation of states where we have 50 Food and Drug Administrations or 50 OSHAs or 50 different provinces of National Institutes of Health. I mean, it's the United States of America is. We're a government that believes that we can do good things for people and with people in cooperation. I think our history shows that.
Your first term in Congress, the 103rd Congress, there was a lot of attention on the federal government and items that were coming up here. In fact, you divide your book, you have several chapters on specific debates. Chapter 5, the budget. Chapter 6, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Chapter 7, the great health care debate. Chapter 8, the crime bill. In that first term, as these measures came through, what was it like as a freshman learning your way through large, complex, and in some cases politically volatile legislation?
It was overwhelming. It was difficult, and I guess the book's laid out chronologically because I know no other way to do it in a sense, or categorize that way. You can't, or by category of issues, understand that it wasn't the budget, then health care, then NAFTA, then crime. It was there was so much overlap, and you were kind of working on all of them at the same time. My first year in office was devoted overwhelmingly to health care and NAFTA. I spent much of my time, probably 80 or 90% of my legislative time on those two issues, unsuccessfully in both. Health care we never got, NAFTA we failed to defeat, but it was very close, and we can talk more about that later because I think that's a pretty interesting part of the book. But you face these issues, you face the overwhelming size and complexity of all these, and it's awfully hard in that short a period of time to get a real grasp on what those issues were all about. I knew pretty early how I would vote on them, but to understand the intricacies and complexities and details was pretty overwhelming when you didn't have much of a base to start with, a base of knowledge as a longer-term member of the institution.
You don't write a lot about the media, but in the chapter on NAFTA, you do have this moment you relate. You were saying that in July that you'd made a speech to the Cleveland City Club talking about the issue of currency stabilization. Then you go on to write, but it wasn't taken seriously either by dismissive press or the single-minded Clinton administration. The media were too busy writing and talking about Ross Perot's belief that there would be a giant sucking sound to bother with more complex issues of potential peso devaluation.
Yeah, James Fallows talks about this. Was one of the best critics of the press as a media person himself, how so often the media wants to report things as a horse race, and they want to, how does this affect Bill Clinton's standing? Is this going to help Ross Perot's presidential race next year? And they picked out Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan and a few others as the spokespeople for the opponents to NAFTA, giving us no intellectual credibility. I mean, they never really spelled out what our real reasons to be against that agreement were. And as a result, the whole elite in this country, from the overwhelming support of the press to former presidents and secretaries of state. That's where the Henry Kissinger terminal affliction, the infliction of terminal importance came up. All the business leaders in the countries were for NAFTA. Even with that, we almost defeated it because the public clearly was against it. And that showed later in the book when I tried to take these same four issues, healthcare, NAFTA, crime, and the budget, and how it played 5 and 6 years later in Fast Track, which was an extension of NAFTA to Latin America. And in really simple terms, Fast Track was defeated not once but twice in this institution, in large part because the public got more engaged. And that's really a big lesson, I think, out of this decade, is that while trade legislation prior to NAFTA was a province of the elite in this country, the Ways and Means members, some lawyers, some trade lawyers in New York and Washington, and the State Department, the Commerce Department. Trade now is more of a public issue, and as the public gets engaged, we're seeing a whole different view of trade reflected. My criticism of Fred Wertheimer was right prior to this vote, and this sort of illustrates, I think, how this whole issue played. Right before the vote, he issued a study of how much labor money was given to those of us that were opposed to NAFTA. We called him and said, are you going to do a study on how much corporate money was given to those that supported NAFTA? And their answer, we didn't talk to him personally, but their answer was, what's that got to do with it? And it's just sort of this view that free trade's good. The rest of us are Luddites with our heads in the sand, unthinking protectionists that are stooges of organized labor. When in fact, the intellectual credibility of our side is much stronger than that, and the public clearly is with the opponents to these trade agreements that undercut worker standards all over the world, that weaken environmental and food safety protections, and undercut the values that we profess to believe in this country.
The issue split party leadership, at least in the Democratic Party. You, Marcy Kaptur, David Bonyer, were active in leading, Mr. Gephardt were active in leading the opposition. How much, though, did that one phrase, giant sucking sound, come to dominate or characterize the debate?
Oh, it did. It characterized it because Ross Perot had a big microphone. There were a bunch of congressmen and women, but nobody knows who we are. Even the leaders, they don't really know it, except somebody like Gingrich that became sort of bigger than life, but mostly people don't know who Congress is. The president's got a big microphone, and Ross Perot had a big microphone. It was easier for the press to talk about the giant sucking sound and jobs leaving the United States than it was to talk about food safety and talk about currency devaluation and talk about what happens with truck weights when they cross the border, talk about the intricacies of tariffs. I mean, that's much more complicated. It's easier to talk about this giant sucking sound, and Ross Perot was quotable. So we in a sense lost the debate then, and then ultimately when Al Gore debated Ross Perot on national TV. And I don't know that Perot knew there was a debate that night, because he was absolutely unprepared. I mean, he offered nothing of substance to our side of the debate, and Gore was pretty good. And Gore, you know, beat the hell out of him because Gore was just so much better prepared. And if we had had Bonyer or Gephardt or somebody like that debating Gore, we would have won that issue, because it would have built the intellectual credibility that our side deserves and has, but didn't come through in the national press enough.
How many people do you think were actually watching that debate?
I don't know how many watched it. It was curious. I mean, I think more people watched it than one would have expected, but it's sort of like doing an ad in the Washington media market, and then all the Washington press writes about this ad, and it gets all this free media attention around the country. More people covered that debate and talked about it on the front pages and on radio talk shows and all that afterwards. So I just think if there had been a more substantive representation on our side, we would have seen a much better coverage to our side, and it would have made a difference.
1993, this is a photo from your book. You have a section of photos. 1993, House Speaker Tom Foley swearing you in. 2 short years later, you have this photo of then House Speaker Newt Gingrich swearing you in. 2 years difference. Describe the difference in the chamber at that point.
Well, it was actually in their individual offices, and I mean, Foley told me stories, and we talked. He talked to my kids. Gingrich was actually very nice, and Gingrich has a charm to him that got him that's partly what got him where he was, and my daughters were sort of intrigued because they knew that I didn't much like this guy, and he probably didn't much like me. Not so much personally, a little bit personally, but more just what he stands for. So. It was an interesting contrast for them and for me both.
But a change of atmosphere in the institution, I guess.
Yeah, that's certainly the change in atmosphere. Gingrich spent his whole career trying to find ways to delegitimize Congress. I mean, he knew that the only way that the Republicans could capture Congress is for people to absolutely detest and despise this institution. And he succeeded in doing that. So that the public really didn't have much good to say about or to think about this institution. But then it came around and bit him, because he became the leader of this institution, and within a few months, he and the institution were even less popular, more unpopular than they were 2 years earlier. In large part because he used words like, this is the first day of the terms like, this is the first day of the revolution. Democrats are pathetic. I mean, they're un-American. I mean, things like that were a direct affront to 70 or 80% of the people in this country. So Really my mission to write this book, in a sense, is an antidote to what Gingrich tried to do for 20 years. I mean, for 20 years, Gingrich wanted people to despise this institution, think government is an absolutely negative role in your life. It can't do anything good. My purpose in writing this is to show that government can be a positive force in our lives, that people can care about this institution and make it work from the inside, and I think we've done that. We've seen bills passed like minimum wage and safe drinking water and Kennedy-Kassenbaum. Pretty good, substantive, only incremental, but substantive health care reform. Even though the leaders of the institution were against it, we've seen it because of public support for it. So if people are in the arena and not simply spectators, this place can work and government can work. And I wanted to show people that. And that's why I hope that college students read this especially, but just people that are interested marginally in government, and that it might be a call to action to them to make this institution run.
At the head of every chapter, you have one or two epigrams that sort of leads off. Here on Chapter 10, I want to ask you about two of these. Chapter 10, the election of 1994, one of the epigrams, Anthony Trollope, the artist who paints for the millions must use glaring colors. Why is that? What does that mean?
That means that to reach in a society where sort of a cacophonous public, sort of a cacophonous environment, that you've got to do something with glaring, broad colors and only a small number of them to get across to the public. You can't talk about 6 things. You can't talk in great detail. And Gingrich had a couple of messages. If you hate government, if you love government, vote for the Democrats. If you hate big government, vote for the Republicans. I mean, it was pretty simple. It's pretty smart. And you have to paint with those kind of bright, glaring colors, wide brush strokes to get the public's attention, to break through all the noise. And I think he especially did that well in 1994.
That was the chapter, the election 94, before Part 2. Part 2, the chapter here, the coup and the revolution. One of the comments you have, the epigrams here. I expect a kiss my ass at high noon in Macy's windows loyalty, President Lyndon Johnson. Well, that leads this chapter off. Why?
Yeah, I would say the one right before that in the same chapter is an Oscar Wilde. He thinks like a Tory, talks like a radical, and that's so important nowadays. And I think they both obviously are a description of Newt Gingrich. And Gingrich was able to do something that most of us were resentful of and jealous of. He was able to get the kind of party support that is almost unprecedented in this institution. There was think back to Joe Cannon when he was Speaker of the House, and a constituent wrote Cannon a letter asking him to send him a copy of the House rules, and Cannon sent back an autographed picture of himself. And Gingrich would have done that if he had thought of it, I'm sure. But Gingrich was able to go around the committee process. The Democrats had vested too much power in committees and not enough in Speaker Foley. Gingrich took the opposite tact and went too far the other way, where he ran everything. Committee chairs were almost superfluous. Henry Hyde used to call himself the sub-chairman, the chairman of Judiciary back in those days. I got an amendment on Medicare once in a bill, just in Commerce Committee. The only Democratic bill amendment in Medicare that passed. It disappeared when it got to the House floor. I mean, I could have challenged it, but I would have lost. Gingrich moved people around, elevated Bob Livingston to chairman of Appropriations above several other members. He had an incredible ability to get people to do what he wanted. In fact, I one time calculated the Ohio delegation. There were then 13 members, I believe, and there were 27 votes cast for the contract on the major issues in Contract of America, and all but one of those votes cast by those 13 members of those 27 were with Gingrich, and it brought to mind a Mark Twain line that when two people think alike all the time, one of them ain't doing much thinking. And Gingrich was, I mean, that's where both the resentment and the jealousy comes in, that this guy was able to keep his people in line so effectively for that first 100 days.
How did he do it?
He did it because he was Moses. I mean, he took the Republicans out of the wilderness. He was a guy that nobody thought Republicans were going to take the majority a year earlier. Gingrich convinced the Republican leadership, the ranking members of the committees, all that, to put everything they could, money and resources and everything else in to take in the House. He convinced them that they could win. He was successful, and nobody would have predicted it a year or 2 or 5 or 10 years before. And he really was their Moses. He began to grate on them after a while, his sort of preachy, school marmish kind of what manner of demeanor and manner of speaking and manner of acting. But at the beginning, he was a very charismatic demigod to them. I thought you were going to pick up the first quote of the first one. I guess you call them epigrams. I just call them quotes. But you do these book reviews, so anyway. But,
Which chapter?
But the beginning of the book on page 3, on election 92, the first quote is from the Oklahoma Attorney General Mike Turpin, and it's, "Politics is show business for ugly people." And while that doesn't set the tone of the book, I thought it would, just something I wanted to mention.
You then lead it off. The next one following that is from Thelonious Monk. It says, "The only cats worth anything are the cats who take chances. Sometimes I play things I never heard myself."
And I put that in there generally because this business of politics is, it's a tough town. It's an unforgiving town. I remember during orientation, I was over, they put us up for a week at the Hyatt down on Capitol Hill. And one day I was having breakfast with David Mann, a freshman from Cincinnati, and then before we went into the orientation meetings. And at the next table was a gentleman who looked very familiar, who was sitting by himself with no one around him, reading a newspaper. People walked by, paid no attention. It was the man who had been Speaker of the House only 3 years before, Jim Wright. And the public, they forgot him. He didn't matter. Nobody cared. Nobody was petitioning. He didn't say Speaker in front of his name anymore. He was just Jim Wright. And you know, when you got a title, this town cares about you. When you don't, they don't. And I think that's a good lesson to learn. But I also think this is a it's a tough town where risk-taking matters, and where courage matters, and where fighting for the right things matter. And that's really the Thelonious Monk that you really do need to step out and be bold and try to do the right thing.
As you follow the book through chronologically, about the period 95 or so, you write about a sense of perhaps dispiritedness among Democrats. How did members pull themselves out of that?
Dick Gephardt grew tremendously during that time, was one way we pulled ourselves out. We looked around, but I got ahead of myself. We looked around that first caucus, and it was miserable. I mean, we had lost 52 seats. People had no business losing, that we thought. We knew that these people that had come in were all very far to the right and very different from what we had seen. None of us liked Gingrich because we all had seen him in operation, trashing this institution for years. And it was, I mean, dispirited is an understatement. Depressed is probably closer to the mark. And finger-pointing. I mean, people were standing up blaming everybody and we could all blame all of us. I mean, it was just one of those things. And but it didn't take long before we realized that we could continue to feel sorry for ourselves, or we could start to fight back on issues. And fortunately, in some ways, maybe unfortunately for the country, maybe fortunately for us, but I'm not sure either of those is quite accurate. Gingrich started doing things that were stupid. I mean, he cut school lunch program. He tried to undercut environmental issues when there's a real consensus in this country in strong environmental laws. There's arguments at the margin, but people don't want to go back to the days of a dirty Lake Erie, or black skies over steel mills, that sort of thing. Oil spills, all the things that have happened. He overstepped on Medicare. I mean, he did this tax cut that was the same size as the Medicare cuts and always said they weren't related. I mean, all these things he overstepped, and he clearly was out of touch with the public. And I almost think that the public was it was sort of like a guy sitting there with a remote watching television, and they were watching George Bush. Zap, we're tired of Bush, we'll try Clinton. They watched Clinton for a while. Well, they tried Perot for a while. Zap, we don't want Perot. Then they tried Clinton. Zap, we don't want Clinton. Then they looked at Tom Foley. Zap, we don't want Tom Foley. Then Gingrich came on TV and gave him a chance, and Zap, I don't think we want him either. And that's really what happened. There's a succession of rejections. The voters rejected Bush. Then they rejected Perot when he was ascendant in the summer of '92. Then they rejected Clinton in '94, Clinton and Foley and the Democrats. Then they pretty quickly rejected Gingrich. And each of those characters believed that the public was voting for them and that they had some kind of mandate, when in fact they were simply rejecting their predecessor. And Gingrich thought the public wanted this total emasculation, dismantling of EPA and OSHA and minimum wage laws. And all this public didn't say at all. The public just thought the Democrats had overstepped and done stupid things. And once both sides understood that, you've seen a more even-handed, less extremist kind of government in the last couple of years, although it still raises its ugly head from time to time.
Why so many rejections in such fast order, then?
Partly the acceleration of media and attention. I mean, the voters get to know us, not us, but higher people than I, get to know the Gingriches of the world and Clinton and Bush and Perot, and get to know them more intimately and more quickly, and can burn out on them. And I think the media is more aggressive in exposing their personal weaknesses and their their idiosyncrasies, as they've done really with all the little stories about Gingrich and Perot and Clinton and all this stuff. But I also think the public was in a pretty angry mood in the early mid-90s and I saw that at home. I mean, some of the things people said to me, and the book has several letters and comments people said. Some of them were funny, like when a woman came up to me and said, "You Sherrod Brown?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, you look a lot better on TV than you do in person." Some were those. Others were, you know, I wish it were medieval times so we could behead you. I mean, some things like that were fairly strong. But you know, but most of that anger is abated, I think.
Somebody also wrote a letter, I think, in here. She came to visit you and saw a committee hearing that you were at and related that it looked like you were having too much fun, and she didn't like that.
Well, she didn't actually come to see me. She came to the committee, and if I'd known she was there, I wouldn't have acted like I was having that much fun. It was a particularly tedious and long, and there's some committee hearings. I mean, I love this job. There are committee hearings that are excruciating. Sometimes they can go 4 or 5 hours, and I usually sit through them, and it's not the most fun part of the job. And my assistant, or healthcare, this was 3 or 4 years ago, was she was getting married in a few months, and I was turning around talking to her about her wedding plans, and we were just kind of laughing a little bit. And I admit, my attention was distracted from whoever was talking, and I didn't know I had constituents out there. I mean, sometimes they're here and you don't know it. So it was, but it was one of those things, and that person probably never voted for me before anyway, and still won't. So.
Take us back to this moment, 1995, right around the time of the government shutdown, if you will. It's a moment you relate in your book. It's a Saturday session of the House, and you write that the Republicans abruptly adjourned and left the floor about 3 p.m., turned the microphones off and whatnot. Democrats refused to leave. What happened?
It was an extraordinary moment in congressional history, not to overstate, be hyperbolic, but I think it really was. The Republicans actually shut the microphones off, and left the chamber. There were literally 100, there were probably 50 or 60 Democrats that stayed, and then another 30 or 40 when they heard what was happening, walked in. And there were a few reporters in the gallery, but no more than a half dozen, I don't think, and 1 or 2 of them wrote about it. And there were some people in the gallery. And we just, people stood up and made speeches. I did not talk. I was thinking about some things I wanted to say and didn't, but probably 15, 20 members stood up and spoke about why they were involved in politics. One guy from New York State, born in Puerto Rico, American citizen. Puerto Rico's, you know, you're American citizen.
Jose Serrano.
Jose Serrano stood up and talked about how he resented Gingrich using the term revolution, because revolutions are fought to help poor children, not to cut school lunches and Medicaid and things like that. But they were said. He talked about, he has the poorest district perhaps in the country, South Bronx, and talked about hardship and not so much his own, but his growing up, but his people in his district, and how this Congress was really an enemy of helping people like his constituents. And John Lewis spoke, who was Martin Luther King's assistant, and he's quoted widely in the book several times. And John really is my hero. I mean, he's an incredible person. And he talked about growing up in segregated Alabama and never saw a white person except for the mailman until he was 6. And John Lewis he was on a radio show we did in our office here, broadcast from here. And John spoke about that. And one member, Chet Edwards from Texas, talked about Bobby Kennedy's influence on him. You know, it was a remarkable time because members of Congress don't talk like that very often, and sort of let their guard down and talk to each other. And it was a terrific, maybe 2 hours. I'm not sure how long it lasted.
What was the significance of that? What happened from that?
Well, I think the significance was that it really showed me, I mean, we're all cynical too much. We're all skeptical of politics and politicians, and those of us in it are skeptical of politics and politicians. But it showed to me that a great majority of my colleagues are here for the right reasons. They're here because they believe in social justice. They're here because they want to fight for people that have less advantage. I'm mostly talking about my Democratic colleagues because I don't know the Republicans as well. I mean, there's plenty of Republicans I like Steve LaTourette and Ralph Reagan and some others, but in terms of Greg Gansky and a few others, but it was just Democrats talking at this moment, and it really showed to me that they're committed to the right causes, to putting government on the side, unlike in the old days when government was controlled by the rich and non-democratic societies for the rich. Now, really, government was, we really could see that we want to put government on the side of people that need help, that are less advantaged, for the environment, for food safety, for social justice, for minimum wage, for worker safety, for all those things.
When did you find time to write this?
I wrote it on nights and weekends, and I'd go through periods of not writing anything, and then I'd have a few days off that I'd just sit and write. And my mother was an English teacher, and she taught me to write, and I think I learned to write pretty quickly, and it was a great experience to do. I mean, I just kind of thought I'd try, and I didn't know if it would ever end up looking like this. So it was an exciting venture, and one that I'll do again someday, maybe in some way.
Where did you do your writing?
I did most of my writing at my computer at my house, and looking out at Lake Erie. I live right on the lake, and living on Lake Erie makes you really appreciate the greatest natural resource in this country, the Great Lakes, and how important that is to my part of the country and really to the whole country and its history of industrial development. Something like 90% of the fresh water, surface water in this country is in the Great Lakes, and how important it is to protect it. And I think that kind of inspired me a little as I was writing, looking out at that, I think.
Did you draw inspiration from previous authors or other books that you've read?
I read every possible book I could find about Congress, from Clem Miller's. Clem Miller's really the last one to write something like this, and he wrote it himself, unlike most books written about Congress. He was in Congress in the late 50s, and just kind of sort of his thoughts and reflections. David Price, a member now, actually wrote his own too. He's a political science professor. But most of the rest of them, I read Don Riegel's book, which he didn't write, but was his words mostly. I read Dick Bolling's book. Then I read a whole lot of people like Richard Fenno, who is actually in the book jacket and is one of maybe the preeminent congressional authority in this country. I read probably 30 books to learn more about the institution. Because I really I did it to write, but I also did it because I'm a better congressman because I know the history of this institution, and I think that's so important for understanding the body and for avoiding mistakes that others have made in the past.
You mentioned Richard Fenno several times in your book. Richard Fenno, the author many years ago of a book called Homestyle. Mm-hmm. What was that book, and what was the importance of it?
Fenno said there are enough people writing books about committee hearings and talking to the president and scheming in Washington. He wrote his book Homestyle was about people at county fairs, and do you hand out shopping bags or nail files? I mean, what do you do when you go home, and what happens when voters run into you at the grocery store? I mean, all of those things, and how you project yourself at home. And in some ways, without being either hypocritical or two-faced, you're different people at home and in Washington. In Washington, it's a different job from when you're home. And you just need to do things in a different sort of, you use your skills, use different skills in different ways. And Fenno taught me a lot reading his book and reading other articles he had written about the importance of what you do at home, not just to getting elected, but really making you a better member of Congress. If you don't do things right at home, you can't represent your district well, frankly.
If you were to teach a class on Congress, what kinds of books would you assign?
Of course, I would not assign mine, but no, doesn't all professors do that? So,
they get to do that.
I would assign Dick Bolling's book because I think it's particularly good about history.
And what's that book?
He's written 3 or 4, and the titles escape me. But he was very critical of the sitting Speaker of the House at the time, John McCormick, which I don't know how that played for Bolling's relationship here with the Speaker. But Price's book's good. I would assign at least one of Fenno's books, Homestyle or another. And I would assign something like Howard Zinn's American People's History of the United States, because I think people need a broader context, not just of what Congress does, but how government operates, not always on the side of the public, often on the side of the public, more in a democracy than the other system. But that's really the challenge to me of reading this book and writing this book is I hope people put it down and think, because I read this book, I want to try to put government on the side of the public and not on the side of interest groups, and I know a little more on how to do that. This book gives me some tools to do that.
What other kinds of things do you read in your free time, or what free time you have? I mean, I notice here on this table we have the Baseball Encyclopedia. I noticed on your desk you have the book that David Halberstam edited, The Greatest Sports Writing of the American Century.
Yeah, I do read more than baseball, but I love baseball. My favorite books are 19th century Russian novels. I love Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. I was a Russian studies major in college. I don't read them in Russian. I would like to think I could, but I can't anymore. I like reading Daniel Boorstin, the former Librarian of Congress, who wrote nonfiction. Sort of the book Discoverers is, to me, one of the best books ever written, because it tells people how you sort of accumulate, how humankind accumulated knowledge over time. I like Will Durant's histories, his 11-volume History of Civilization. I like mostly fiction, but I like Toni Morrison. She's grew up where I live, and she's one of the greatest writers this country's produced. My daughter's, she's my daughter's favorite writer. They actually had a chance to meet her, which was pretty exciting.
This may be a small point, but throughout this book, you sprinkle factlets, I suppose you could say, small historical facts. Let me just give you a couple examples. You cite that the 19th century House Speaker Thomas Reed, who once referred to the Senate as, quote, a communion of old grannies and tabby cats. You're talking about the operations of the House, and you throw in that the House mace, which was crafted in 1841. You mentioned bloodstains, which can still be seen on House steps, of Kentucky Representative William Talby, the bloodstains can still be seen on the northeast steps 5, 6, 7, 8. Where did you learn these facts about the House?
I went down and talked to the House architect one day about sort of interesting nooks and crannies of this place. I love doing this job, but I also love the sort of the ambiance of where I work. I want to know. I mean, I remember a story years ago in Sports Illustrated. They asked people like Ryne Sandberg about Ernie Banks, and he didn't really know anything about him. They asked Don Mattingly about Lou Gehrig, same position, same team, 50 years later. Barely heard of him. They asked, one guy came in, shortstop, and watched some reruns of Home Run Derby and spring training in Pittsburgh, and this shortstop never heard of Mickey Mantle. I don't want to, I mean, it's not as important in baseball to know history as it is in Congress, but I want to know what this body was all about. I want to know the personal side, and I want to know the institutional and historical side. And I think I do the job better because of that. I think I serve my constituents better because of that. Plus, it's just interesting. It's interesting to know and learn about big characters that were here. One guy I served with, Jamie Whitten, is a fascinating story himself. He was a congressman from Mississippi, elected 3 months before Pearl Harbor, September 1941. 83 people in my class were not, his last term was my freshman term. 83 people in my class were not yet born when Jamie Whitten came to Congress. And he was a perfect example of, he was a segregationist, very conservative Southern Democrat. When the Civil Rights Acts passed, he became a moderate because he had 40% black constituents, and he decided he'd represent them because now they vote. For good motives or bad motives, he became a more representative, better member of Congress. But one member, somebody went up to Jamie Whitten in 1991. He'd been in office 50 years, and they said, "Jamie, you go back to Mississippi much?" And he said, "Hell, everybody I know in Mississippi's dead." And so he had been here so long, he didn't know anybody at home anymore. I mean, he's the exception. But he has he served for 1/4 of the history of this country. He'd been in Congress. John Dingell and his father have been here a third, well, more than 1/4 of the time that this country's been a country. You can learn a lot from institutions like that, institutions within the institution.
You've served in the majority, you've served in the minority, you've worked with your party's leadership, you've occasionally worked against your party's leadership. Is there any single moment, or it's even a fair question, that it all came together for you, what serving in Congress meant?
I guess it's a fair question. I don't know what a fair answer is. I think when we defeated Fast Track, nobody thought we could. Trade issues, as I said earlier, trade issues had always been the province of a small number of people in this country. The Commerce Committee, the Commerce Department, the State Department, a few trade lobbyists and lawyers, and a few members of Ways and Means. And we after losing to NAFTA, we knew we had to open it up to the public. And I went to Mexico right before the Fast Track vote because I wanted to see the face of free trade, what it looked like. And 3 miles from the United States, rented a car, my own expense, went to Mexico, went to McAllen, Texas, rented a car, went to Reynosa, Mexico. Spent several hours at people's homes. Husband, wife, auto workers, worked at GM, the largest employer in Mexico, make $40 a week, lived in a home with no electricity, no running water, dirt floors. Happy kids running around. Kids are happy when their parents love them, as these children obviously were lucky enough to have parents like that. But these were people that worked for an auto company 3 miles from the United States. They didn't have electricity or running water, and they lived in a terrible shack. Next door, a fellow was suffering from neurological brain damage because he worked for an American company where he put his hands in a lead-based solution every day. That same company in the United States makes the same product, but the government won't let him use lead. I mean, and all this kind of came together when I saw when I saw what that meant and saw what NAFTA meant and saw what Fast Track meant, and those stories and some other things helped us energize the public and defeat that agreement. I think that's when all of this kind of came together, and I saw that we, in fact, you could be effective in this job. The public really could have a major influence in what happened, and things would work.
This is the book, Congress from the Inside, Observations from the Majority and the Minority. It's published by Kent State University Press in 1999. Its author, Congressman Sherrod Brown. Thank you very much.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Doug.
Representative Sherrod Brown is ranking member of the House Commerce Subcommittee on Health and the Environment. He's currently serving his 4th term in Congress. His book is published by Kent State University Press. Contact them online for more information.